Everyone, I'm Stephen Simon, Senior Research Analyst at the Quincy Institute. Today, we're hosting a discussion on the direction down the road of U.S. policy in Syria in the wake of several dramatic developments. One, of course, was the reintegration of Syria under Assad into the Arab League. The second is something that we've learned from the Discord cache of documents, which is that Iran and Russia have engaged in joint planning to intensify attacks against the United States troops now in Syria. There are about 900 troops in Syria. And thirdly, the congressional response to the reintegration of Assad and Syria into the Arab League, which is a bill now circulating on the Hill, which would intensify the use of secondary sanctions to prevent primarily Arab states from investing in and contributing to the reconstruction of Syria. Lastly, there's a wild card in the form of the re-election of Erdogan in Turkey. Turkey is involved deeply in Syria, has forces in Syria. So we'll want to address the implications of his re-election as well. Our panelists, we've got a very strong panel today, very distinguished panel. Just starting on my screen from the top right is Bill Roebuck. William Roebuck is ambassador and deeply involved in Middle Eastern affairs throughout most of his career. Did two stints, as far as I'm aware, in Syria. One in the mid-2010s. In the mid-2000s, I guess it's 2005 timeframe. And he figures prominently in WikiLeaks and so forth on his activities at the U.S. Embassy as were you political counselor there?
Yes.
Yeah, as political counselor at the U.S. Embassy. But then again, very recently, he was embedded with U.S. forces in northeastern Syria and has an intimate sense of how the U.S. presence functions in Syria, what its mission is, and how successful it is, and undoubtedly views as to whether or not it's a good thing and it serves U.S. interests. Then James Jeffrey was ambassador, was a career ambassador in the State Department, quite a distinguished role, was ambassador to Turkey and Iraq, and I believe Albania as well. These were key posts. Turkey and Iraq were key posts in the Middle East. And most importantly here, though, he was the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria up until relatively recently. So he will be a fascinating complement to Bill's on-the-ground assessment of the U.S. role, given his broader policy responsibilities, his Washington-based responsibilities. Mara Revkin is a senior scholar at Duke University. She's both a lawyer and a laureled academic who has in-depth experience with NGOs and UN agencies that are working in Syria. She provides, therefore, a very different perspective, but one that will shed interesting light on what we hear about U.S. policy. Joshua Landis is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, Those who follow Syria issues will know that he's an important voice, scholarly voice, on issues relating to Syria. Has had a lot of experience living in Syria as well as in the broader Middle East. A very distinguished scholar. So I'm counting on Josh not just to comment on the U.S. role in Syria, but also on the geopolitical dimension. I mean, I'm hoping none of the panelists hold back on that, regardless. But I'm looking forward to hearing what Josh has to say in particular. So let's crack on. I'd like to start with Jim and Bill, and ask the two of you, starting with Jim, what is U.S. policy towards Syria right now, and how do you both assess it? Just take a few minutes to run through that for us.
I'll take the first stab. First of all, thanks for having me on, Steve, and thanks to the Quincy Institute. Right now, in contrast to the situation in the Obama administration, particularly John Kerry's efforts, and in the Trump administration, particularly the efforts that Bill and I were involved with, where whether you like the policy or not, the policy was crystal clear. The Biden administration policy on Syria is not crystal clear. There is no senior official that is publicly the face of it. There is considerable confusion in the region and in Washington about what exactly we're trying to do. And that's led to some of the congressional complaints, bipartisan complaints that we've seen on keeping the troops on keeping the Caesar sanctions on, and generally what is going on, folks. And that's important because we have troops on the ground and many other interests. All right, second point, the Syrian war is in a frozen state. It's a frozen conflict at this point with what amounts to a whole series of informal ceasefires. Assad has not won. Assad has not lost, and he will not lose in the sense that nobody's trying to overthrow him, and Russia and Iran will not allow that to happen regardless of what happens. However, and this gets to the extent we can say what U.S. policy is over the last three administrations, once in the late Obama administration, even the pro forma overthrow Assad policy was given up, which was confirmed formally in the Trump administration. U.S. policy has been guided by a set of principles to leverage the various things from military presence and activities of us and others to sanctions to recognition, non-recognition, accountability, to fix a bunch of problems that have arisen that are of serious regional security concern. The Islamic State, the set of security concerns that Turkey has on its southern border, the Iranian presence, particularly its long-range missiles, and what concerns the Arabs burrowing into the Syrian state and society like they've seen in Iraq and particularly Lebanon. The 6 million refugees and 6 million IDPs who fled Assad's areas, that's half the population. How do you reintegrate them? How do you reintegrate roughly 35% of the country that is under the control of essentially U.S. and Turkish forces and their local allies, some 200,000 strong, if you add all of them in the Northeast and the Northwest? What about the Captagon drug crisis fueled by the Assad regime, which is the latest of, it's now, I used to call it 6, but now it's 7. And finally, a whole series of accountability things at the UN, the OPCW for chemical weapons and others. So that layers on top of the basic civil war. But the third level, and you mentioned this, Steve, is the geopolitical issue. This was something that we seized upon with a lot of opposition in and outside the U.S. government and around the world in 2018, that this was also a geopolitical conflict for the future security regime or absence of regime in the middle of the Middle East. And this has become, I think, ever more clear, particularly, Steve, with, as you said, the leaked documents and the leaked comments confirming those documents that we've just seen in the Washington Post. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Jim. Bill?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Quincy Institute for the invitation. Really happy to be here and delighted to discuss these issues with old friends and colleagues. Jim gave a pretty good laydown of U.S. policy. I would just make a couple of observations. First, I would say that U.S. Syria policy has a sort of cobbled together feel to it. I mean, the basic pillars are there. They've been there for quite a while. There's our counter ISIS strategy in northeastern Syria, bolstered by a military presence there. There's advocacy for a political solution for Syria under UN Security Council Resolution 2254. There's leaning in, this is especially an accent of the Biden administration, but it was already present, leaning in on humanitarian impulses. The U.S. is by far the biggest donor of humanitarian aid, and whenever Secretary Blinken or others attempt to restate U.S. policy, humanitarian assistance is often highlighted. And then there's the insistence, and Jim mentioned this, the accountability for the Assad regime's war crimes and crimes against humanity. There's a couple of newer accents to our policy as well. Secretary Blinken has talked recently about no normalization, despite whatever our friends and allies out in the region might be doing. This is not really a change in policy, but it makes clear that we're not going to be influenced by what our partners out in the region are doing. There's also an interesting emphasis, it's not a public emphasis, but it is in the media, on U.S. efforts to seek the release of hostages captive in Syria. This has been in several media stories recently. I only mention it because it is the sole effort right now, the sole driving rationale for U.S. officials to meet directly with Syrian officials. There are reports in the media of 2 meetings with senior U.S. officials in Oman, in Muscat, to try to seek the release of Austin Tice and others. I think, normally this would be a subset, not really a strategic issue, but it is the sole reason that U.S. officials are meeting with Syrian officials right now, so it deserves mention. The other point I would mention, and Jim alluded to it, is congressional insistence on tougher sanctions, and particularly tougher sanctions enforcement. The Caesar sanctions are already on the books. There is the bill that, Steve, you mentioned about a tougher enforcement of those sanctions, and a new bill, anti-Assad normalization bill, really focused on trying to make it more and more difficult for countries in the region that want to normalize with Assad to do so. And then I think there's a Ukraine factor that's involved in our policy now on Syria, which is, I think our side is hardened, and I have a sense that the Iranian side is also hardened, and maybe there's more willingness to take risks. And this is evident in the story you talked about, that maybe there's a Russian Iranian calculation of wanting to attack U.S. troops as a way to inflict casualties and drive them out of northeastern Syria. On our side, I think there's a sense of wanting to stay in Syria and insist on that leverage with U.S. troops as a way to deprive Assad, but particularly Putin, of any sort of win. Those are the sort of basic elements I would highlight on U.S. policy in Syria. And the only other thing I mentioned, and I mentioned at the beginning, there's a sort of a cobbled together feel to it. Jim also talked about it in his own way. Some of it is because it's inherited from Trump administration, and even chunks of it from the Obama administration. Some of it is because of congressional pressure that is at odds with the maybe political policy instincts of the Biden team in the White House. And some of it has to do with strategic apathy about Syria and about what to do in Syria, not wanting to get too involved, but wanting to do the right sort of signaling about policy. I'll stop there, but those are just some of the things I see about U.S. policy.
Yeah, it does have a cobbled together feel, but in part, as you say, because it's alluvial. I mean, it's developed over several administrations in changing circumstances, but also because it's ultimately multifaceted. I mean, there are a number of interests at work that the United States seems to be trying to serve by maintaining a military posture in Syria, as well as some of the other diplomatic steps and sanctions related steps it has taken. Let's get the view from outside the U.S. government, from a more international perspective, but also one that has entailed working on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Mara.
First, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with this esteemed panel. So I would say, just speaking to the U.S. role in Syria, and I wish we had a Syrian perspective on this panel. I can never speak on behalf of Syrian civilians, but I would try to just offer some insights from what I've learned from many conversations with Syrians and Iraqis over the past several years working in Iraq and Syria with humanitarian organizations on these issues. So I would start out by acknowledging that the U.S. role from a civilian perspective in Syria is incredibly complex, and Syrian public opinion is equally complex. So in 2011, many Syrians were calling for U.S. intervention after the uprising, but as the movement, what was initially peaceful, devolved into obviously the protracted civil war that we're still in. U.S. airstrikes then killed thousands of Syrian civilians and obviously caused an enormous amount of human suffering and economic devastation. And as a result, that's led to a lot of anger and disappointment with U.S. policy. But that said, and despite the undeniable harm that U.S. military operations have caused in Syria, most Syrians I talk to in Northeast Syria do feel that some continued U.S. military presence there is absolutely essential to maintaining security and to filling a vacuum that would otherwise immediately be occupied by some very bad actors, including ISIL, or the remnants of ISIL now trying to regroup, and Iran. And that includes Syrians who may see the U.S. as a bad or particularly not good actor, but would still prefer the U.S. presence to other actors that they consider even worse. So I could say a little bit more about the security dynamics and different actors in play here. So as others have mentioned, the conflict has been in a somewhat frozen state, or state of relatively reduced violence, since 2020. When I was in Northeast Syria last summer for some work with the NGO community on the security situation in and around Al-Hol camp, it was clear that this is an incredibly precarious situation, where numerous threats are just barely being contained below the surface. And Syrian authorities and humanitarian actors are extremely worried that we're just one prison break of ISIL fighters or one missile attack away from a major crisis. So and Northeast Syria, as others have also alluded to, is this really a nexus of intense competition between at least 3 different adversarial coalitions. So we have the Kurdish forces supported by the U.S., then we have Iran and Russia and their various proxies, including Hezbollah, and then also the remnants of ISIL, which appear to be working with other organized criminal actors to smuggle weapons, money, and people. So this is just sort of a brief overview of the different actors in play here, and I would say that the continuing presence of around 900 U.S. troops in Northeast Syria with a limited mission of supporting our local partners, the SDF, I consider to be very, very critical for maintaining security in Northeast Syria. It's a small presence, but it's one that Kurdish authorities I spoke with view as incredibly essential. There are So we've already seen a number of prison breaks out of the SDF-controlled prisons where tens of thousands of ISIL members are detained. There's also the separate issue of the Al-Hol camp, where more than 55,000, mostly women and children, believed to have family or other ties to ISIL, have been confined. And there's a real concern that ISIL is potentially infiltrating that camp and using it for fundraising and recruitment purposes. So I would just say that in terms of, I think in addition to the presence, to the threat posed by ISIL, the U.S. does need to be really concerned about the presence of Russia and Iran. So Russia had a significant presence in Syria over the past many years of the conflict, but has increasingly withdrawn to prioritize its war in Ukraine. So it's both a really fragile situation and one where balances of power are shifting in ways that that could be destabilizing to the benefit of Iran. As Russia withdraws further, it becomes even more dependent on Iran for trade to get around sanctions and weapons for the war in Ukraine, including drones. I think we'll continue to see Iran exploiting these security vacuums in Syria to expand its influence. I'll stop there.
That was great, Maura. Thanks very much. We're going to return to all these questions shortly, particularly the role of the U.S. military in securing the safety of populations in that area, especially the role of the U.S. or non-role of the U.S. in securing the Al-Hol complex and that of other camps. But let's turn to Josh Landis before we go back to some of these questions for a deeper dive. Josh, a couple of things. One, I guess these are they. One, which pertains to the situation in Syria itself, is speaking maybe hypothetically, well, necessarily hypothetically, I suppose. Could the Syrian state assume the security responsibilities that Maura has just described as being so essential in the Northeast and carried out by the U.S., the small U.S. presence there? And then more broadly on the geopolitical side of things, there seems I've detected a tension in the accounts of U.S. policy that we've just heard between a view that our Arab Gulf partners in particular are warranted in wondering about the U.S. policy, its purposes, and the U.S. resolve and its commitment to securing its objectives as we've heard them outlined in Syria. But at the same time, our Gulf Arab partners and other Arab states in the Arab League have come out foursquare against the thrust of U.S. policy as we've heard it here from Jim and Bill. How do you square those things? Anyway, those are my questions for you, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on this panel, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. Let me start. There are two aspects to this. There is the American military presence in the Northeast, and then there's the overall policy towards Damascus and Syria, which is the front of which is sanctions, the biggest hammer of which is sanctions. Let me begin, though, before talking about that and where that puts us today, especially with the Arab normalization process, a little bit about America's larger policy towards Syria, which I think has failed very badly. And that is, originally, the idea was that Assad was going to fall. He has a terrible regime, and he was going to fall pretty naturally. And people were, saying 6 months, whatever. And he didn't fall. Very quickly, the United States found itself entrapped in another dilemma that was much like Iraq. This time, they did not want the Syrian army to fall apart. And that became an overriding concern. They did want to get Assad out, but they didn't want the army to be destroyed. And Mike Morrell, deputy director of CIA, expressed this very clearly in a 2013 interview in which he said it would be a disaster for the Syrian army to fall like Iraq's because the country might split into pieces and militias like Al-Qaeda would come to dominate. And that was the fear. So America found itself trapped. In a sense, it had been given, the CIA and others in the State Department had been given the directive to try to get rid of Assad at the same time as they didn't want to destroy the army. And this caused I think, sort of a brain meltdown in the American foreign policy apparatus, because how do you get rid of Assad without getting rid of the military? The top 40 generals in the military are all Alawites, and they're totally beholden to Assad. At any rate, I don't want to go into a long critique, but it's the importance of this is that America gave up the idea of regime change very early. And sanctions today do not have the object of regime change. The newest bill, 3202, the House resolution bill that's now being presented, in fact, admits the fact that there is no plan to stop the suffering of the Syrian people by getting rid of the Assad regime. In fact, this new resolution extends the Caesar sanctions from 2025 to 2032. And it does this because it knows that Assad's going to be there in 2032, and that this is just becomes then a regime to crush the Syrian economy and to keep Syria in ruins. And that's my fear, that American policy has really become about keeping Syria in ruins. And I want to quote Ambassador Jeffrey in his exit interview he said that our plan A, the whole purpose of our plan A, is to ensure that the Russians and Assad and the Iranians don't have a happy answer to how this all ends. They are tied up in knots. They don't see Syria as a victory. And in a sense, that has become the major thrust of American policy in Syria, which is not to allow Syria to rebuild. And the Syria sanctions, the Caesar sanctions, are designed to not to allow companies and outside foreign investment into Syria to rebuild the grid, the electric grid, to get the new aircraft, to redo the schools, and to rebuild the state in order to keep Assad weak, in order to hurt the Russians and the Iranians. Now, the Arab governments in the normalization process have been working with the United States. Saudi Arabia, our major Gulf allies, have been working with the United States. But now they have come to the sort of a crossroads in which they've decided that US policy is not going to work. There is no exit strategy for Assad. There is no end to the beleaguered and traumatized Syrian people who need to rebuild their lives. And they've decided that American policy isn't working. It's not going to get Iran out of Syria. It's only going to ensconce Iran further in Syria, as well as Russia. And so they've decided on a new strategy, which is we have to engage. We have to rebuild Syria. And it's go through diplomacy and rebuilding that we're going to get leverage with Assad to stop the drug trade, the illegal drug trade, by opening up legal trade, and also, hopefully, to diminish the influence of these bad actors, as Maura said, by getting involved and having Saudi money and UAE money and other Gulf money involved in rebuilding Syria and purchasing the goodwill of Syrian politicians. Now, obviously, I know I can already hear the critique of this is that this is a heavy push. It is. It's a heavy lift to try to replace Iran, or not replace, but to compete with Iran, and to weaken Assad's dependence on Iran. And that is a heavy lift. But America's policy today does not have answers for the Syrian people. It only is going to worsen the humanitarian outcomes, and I think is going to hurt America's strategic interests in the region, which should be working with our allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, to try to improve a Syria policy, not to be at loggerheads with them. And that's what we're doing now. By introducing this bill, we are taking on the Saudis, the UAE, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Algerians, all those countries, and the Turks, who are trying to rebuild and get involved in the reconstruction of Syria so that they can guide return of refugees, stopping the illegal drug trade, and hopefully diminishing Iran's influence. And I don't think America wants to find itself once again at war with Saudi over Syria. We have lots of differences with Saudi Arabia, but we need to keep Saudi Arabia as an ally. We need to keep Turkey as an ally. And we're alienating our biggest friends in the Middle East through our policy over a country which is not that central to American interests in the Middle East, and we're hurting the humanitarian outcome.
Okay, so we've just heard, we've just seen Josh throw down the gauntlet on regarding U.S. policy, describing it as harmful not just to U.S. geostrategic interest, but also to the humanitarian cause that the United States is pursuing in a very narrow, sort of limited sense in Syria. This is a pretty comprehensive critique. So I'd like to hear the other three panelists respond to this from different or perhaps overlapping perspectives. So first, from Mara, what's your nightmare scenario in Syria if the U.S. pulled out, but at the same time, it's a hypothetical scenario, continued to impede reconstruction in Syria? So what happens?
So I think, what we already have, I consider to be a nightmare scenario, as Joshua alluded to. I mean, Syria is destroyed economically and in terms of infrastructure. We already have significant ISIL activity in Northeast Syria. So it's a question of sort of what will be an even bigger catastrophe that will sort of force the U.S. sort of inevitably to re-engage militarily or force other actors to come in. I think that could look like another major prison break. I think it could be further escalation due to sort of similar to sort of the missile exchanges and sporadic sort of conflict that we've seen between the U.S. And Iran playing out in Northeast Syria. So I feel like we already are in more of a crisis than we realize, and it's a matter of I think this would become more obvious and more urgent with sort of a further drawdown of the U.S. presence there. So I would say another particular concern that I have is about sort of the lack of any sort of vision or long-term solution for the population in Al Hol camp, which is a presumptively civilian population. None of those people have been accused of anything. They're confined, stigmatized because they're believed to be children or wives of ISIL members, but there are also another 10,000 at least who are Iraqi refugees who fled there long before ISIL and are totally innocent of any association. And they've just sort of been left by the international community or sort of warehoused, as one might say, kind of in Northeast Syria, where the Kurds are now left with the sort of impossible task of both sort of trying to provide that population with assistance and containing security. And it's just not possible, and it's not sustainable. I'm not sure that it can even be sustained with the sort of limited presence, U.S. presence that we have now, because we've come very close before with previous prison breaks to sort of complete chaos. And I guess I would, so I'll stop there because I want to let others respond to this too.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. It wasn't clear to me from your previous remarks and this intervention exactly what role the U.S. forces in Syria, Northeast Syria, have in containing the Al Hol problem.
So the role and the mission of the U.S. presence in Syria is clear. The coalition's mission is clear in working with and through our Kurdish SDF local partners to build their capacity and support them in their ongoing fight against ISIL. So I think this isn't. I think this is clearly primarily a mission of support. The Kurds, the SDF, are the primary actors. Are responsible for security around Al-Hol and the prisons. The U.S. nonetheless plays an incredibly important role in training and also sort of providing assistance and support. So I think to sort of remove that capacity building and training would be very detrimental to security. And I would say also that there are a number of concerns both about corruption and potential human rights violations being perpetrated by the SDF in various capacities, both as security forces and in terms of their governance. And I think that the U.S., to the extent that we are providing significant assistance to Kurdish authorities in northeast Syria, has an obligation to remain engaged and exercise some scrutiny over this assistance and provide guidance and sort of feedback on compliance with international standards and human rights as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's continue with the on-the-ground view in responding to Josh's challenge. So over to you, Bill. From your perspective, your recent perspective in Syria, how do you view Josh's critique?
I would say there are elements of it that are valid. I mean, my own sense of U.S. broader Syria policy, not the policy in the Northeast, which I think was more or less effective for what it was set out to do. But Josh's real critique is the broader Syria policy. I do think our Syria policy has led and continues to embed a deep impasse over what should take place in Syria. And I don't see a way. I mean, given the forces that have shaped that policy, some legacy policy elements, and especially a strong congressional focus on it now, and a certain sense that the Biden team is looking at other strategic interests that don't have anything to do with Syria. So there's a whatever you want to call it, strategic apathy or a distraction from Syria. I see the overall impasse in policy continuing. I do think the humanitarian situation is dire, and it is deteriorating by the day, according to the literature I read from the UN and from NGO groups. But I don't, given who is shaping Syria policy right now in the United States, I don't see this changing. I think the one thing I would mention that is missing from Josh's critique, which motivates a lot of the elements in the U.S., has to do with accountability by the Assad regime for what they have done. I mean, you're talking about a regime that has committed massive human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and it motivates American policymakers, members of Congress, but also members of Syrian opposition.
Bill, can I jump in for a second? And how does the Caesar sanctions make Assad repent or bring justice to Assad? It seems to me that the injustice that they bring to the 16, 17 million people under the government control is infinitely larger than the inconvenience that it causes Assad and his cronies, who still live in palaces and eat, shrimp cooked by their cooks every night, and while everybody else is starving. This doesn't bring justice. If you want to bring justice, go kill them. Do something, but don't hurt the poor people who've already been beaten down for over 12 years and have no capability of getting rid of this government. We've discovered that. So I just don't see the whole justice thing. Seems to me a big dust cloud, because it's not bringing justice. That's why the Arabs are re-engaging. They want justice too. They're not insensible to that, but they just can't see how to get it.
Right.
this sanctions regime?
I mean, look, I would just say that, people who are shaping our Syria policy disagree with you on that. I hear you. I understand your perspective on it, but the driving force in those sanctions is we are not going to let Assad and his regime get away with this. Yes, the regime is going to eat well at their dinner table at night. It's not going to affect their quality of life or any way, but it is going to prevent the regime from rebuilding. It's going to limit many things that the Assad regime would like to do to consolidate its power. My personal view is that this is, as I said, this is leading to an impasse that is worsening the humanitarian situation. I do agree with that, but I would just say one other caveat, and I'll let Jim jump in on this. One caveat is that the humanitarian situation, although aggravated by sanctions, is far, far more the responsibility of the Assad regime and what it has done in the last 10 years. Sanctions have had an impact, but nothing compared to the impact that Syrian regime has had on the Syrian people. And I'll leave it at that.
So that suggests that it's in our interest to perpetuate that impact. I'm just a little puzzled by that.
I mean, personally, I question the value of continuing the sanctions regime, at least all of them, in the way that they're constituted right now. Certainly, you have to distinguish between the sanctions that are aimed at punishing the regime for corruption or for crimes against humanity. I support those. Some of the broader impact sanctions, I'm not as sure about. My real point is that the people who are shaping it feel strongly about it, and they're driving this train. People in Congress and others, and this is where we are with the sanctions right now. So
let me follow up with a question for Jim. And others who want to weigh in on this. In terms of the geopolitics, how far do you think the U.S. should go in pushing back against the Arab normalization process? I mean, if the Arabs, if the Gulf Arabs in particular, are committed to normalization, and they're already staking out, as others have said here, staking out positions on important issues that differ from the U.S. approach. There are tensions, some serious tensions in bilateral relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and U.S. and UAE, in particular. To what extent does the value we put on accountability in the Syrian context, forgetting about all the other stuff, to what extent does that warrant deepening fissures between the U.S. and its Gulf partners?
I don't think it does. First of all, leaving aside the fact that the administration was all over the map on how it reacted to those Arab. I was in close consultation with the Jordanians and others over the last 2 years on what was initially the King Abdullah plan that he briefed to Putin in the summer of 2021. This has been briefed many times in Washington. I was a bit surprised at Blinken's very strong reaction to it. But it's going to take me a couple of minutes to get to why I'm not all that problematic. I don't have a big problem with the Arab plan, at least in principle, because we have to go back to a couple of things said. First of all, the biggest element of U.S. foreign policy towards Syria, it was not the sanctions. It was, beginning in 2018, a powerful military coalition that we put together involving American support that I can't get into to an ever more successful Israeli operation, taking the U.S. forces that were on the ground, as Mara said, legally fighting ISIS, operationally supporting the SDF. But in fact, look at our troops at Al-Tam from the very south, which has nothing to do with neither. It's basically denying terrain and supporting the Turks in their denying of terrain in northwest Syria, particularly in Idlib. Now, we have our problems with the Turks. That's a whole sub-issue. And Mara, that would have been the fourth major element in the northeast you have running around shooting at everybody. But Syria is terribly complicated, and I'm trying to keep it simple. What we were doing with that was to freeze the conflict, which we succeeded in, and secondly, use these levers, the military lever, the Turkish, the American, the SDF, the various Turkish allies, and the Israeli air operations as a quid, something that is acting for certain reasons, but can stop acting, along with the sanctions, along with the accountability things in the UN and 2254 is mentioned, to make a deal. We did this with the Russians all the way up to a 2-hour meeting with Putin in 2019. What we said is, you remember earlier, and I didn't say it for no reason, those 7 issues, we didn't have Capticon them, but we've added it. ISIS, the Iranian presence with the missiles in particular, the Turkish security concerns, the 12 million refugees and IDPs, the reintegration of a third of Syria back into the country and 200,000 or so armed people, and finally the accountability issues and now Capticon. What we said to the Russians was, you get with the Syrians and their Iranian friends and you start fixing these things, because we don't want to overthrow Assad. We're not trying to get you out, but we need these things fixed. The Turks need these things fixed. The international community does, the UN does, the Israelis do, and we do. I forgot ISIS is one of the 7. You start working with us to fix these things, and we will start lifting sanctions. We will start all of the things that we are doing that you don't like and Assad doesn't like and the Iranians don't like, we will step by step stop doing. What happened was we got the situation frozen. Putin thought about it. And at the end, the Russians didn't nibble. They claimed that the Iranians were blocking it and that Assad was being difficult. Both were true, but I don't know if the Russians were really negotiating. Then the new administration came in with essentially the same set of quids, if you will, of sticks that we were using, but they didn't engage with the Russians other than peripherally, and they didn't, of course, engage with the Syrians. So the Arabs looked at this and said, okay, we can do this. That's the whole logic of King Abdullah's plan, which kicked this whole thing off. The Arabs said, we'll go and talk to the Syrians about this. And I believe that the administration basically said, yeah, that's a good idea, but here are all the things you got to fix. Because you, Arabs, don't own many of these sticks. The only stick you own is keeping them out of the Arab League and not recognizing them. But if you're going to talk to them, you have to do that. I would point out on the humanitarian situation, there is no sanction on humanitarian assistance. In fact, the United States gives hundreds of millions of dollars every year to Assad areas for humanitarian support. And there is no blockage to this. In fact, one reason Congress is taking these steps is because this administration has been extremely liberal. You can drive a Mack truck through the exceptions that they make on humanitarian and early reconstruction to try to get money in. The problem is nobody, Joshua, wants to give this guy money. How much money do the Arabs pledge at the Arab League conference just for humanitarian aid, which they could do without sanctions? As I said, we give hundreds of millions. There are no sanctions on humanitarian aid. They didn't write any checks. What they're doing is essentially, I don't think they'll do it as well, and we didn't succeed, is they're saying, you've got to fix these things, Capticon, get the refugees back, get the Iranians out, be to one or another degree accountable, and we'll work with the Americans, with the Turks, with the Israelis, with the UN to try to relieve all of these things that are being done. It's essentially the same deal that we were offering Assad through the Russians that the Arabs are offering now. They've put the deal on the table. Assad, be it with the Arabs, be it with repeated contacts with the Turks that I follow very, very closely, be it with what the Israelis are hearing, Assad is giving everybody the finger. So nothing is going to move.
Let me jump in here. Let me jump in here with 2 things. One, just a small thing, which is that we all know that the sanctions don't affect humanitarian aid. What we're arguing is that humanitarian aid keeps the population on a slow drip, and reconstruction and reconstitution of the economy is what's really necessary to help the population. But more significantly, the one stick that we have that you've emphasized others lack has not worked.
Right. If I could jump in and just say that, what's the future going to bring? Now, I understand, America's arguments with why Assad is bad. But the future, if I can just play the crystal ball here, is that this administration has committed itself to supporting the Kurds and staying in Northeast. It doesn't want another bloody nose like it did in Afghanistan. It took the fall in Afghanistan and it pulled our troops out. Very difficult thing to do. I think the right thing to do, but it hurt Biden. He's not going to do that in Northeast Syria because that's going to hurt too.
Right.
But somebody is going to do it. Trump, your old boss, tried to do it and failed. But the next administration or the administration after that is going to pull out, and everybody knows it. That's why Assad's not giving anything, and that's why nobody is giving anything, because they know that America's going to leave because this isn't that important. And Iran right now, as we know, is gearing up to try to kill a few more Americans and ratchet up the pressure. And with the Arab normalization of Syria, it's going to put all the Arabs on the hot seat, because when they normalized, they promised. They all signed on to the restoration of Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty, which means the Americans have to leave and the Turks have to leave. Now, when they're really stuck to it, who are they going to side with? Are they going to side with the fellow Arab Damascus government, or are they going to side with America once it comes to blows and America's new, A-10s and HIMARS into Syria begin to shoot at the Iranians and other Syrians? Really, it'll be Syrian proxies who are going to be killed. Where does this lead us? It just leads us into more conflict over what? We're going to
hold on. I disagree here. First of all,
okay.
I heard similar arguments because half of my life is spent in the European realm, not the Middle East. I heard the same arguments about 2014.
Gosh, you're Euro trash.
2014 on Crimea and the Donbass. Well, these are mainly Russian areas. The whole point is we don't want to see new Syrias. And we're not seeing any new Syrias. Russia and Iran have been very careful because to some degree they are tied down in first Syria and secondly in other areas where there's pushback against them. That's how you do geopolitical back and forth. And you use all of the tools, military tools and other tools. The answer of how does this all end? How does Korea end? We've been in a frozen conflict now for over 60 years. Sometimes there isn't a solution. Now, the main argument against this, and I acknowledge this in all of my public statements, is the humanitarian one. But here's the problem. As I said, and Steve is right, humanitarian assistance, that can flow. It isn't flowing from the Arab world, but it is flowing from us and the rest of the West massively. It's flowing from the Turks and the Jordanians for the refugees. But this is a $300 to $400 billion bill to fix what mainly, as Bill Roebuck said, Assad and his Russian bomber friends have done. Who's going to put that money up? Who's going to put that money up with a guy that
the Syrian people will put it up if they're allowed to, and other investors. And this is, no one's asking America to rebuild Syria. The Arab countries have asked that have sanctions lifted so that they can rebuild and so that Syrians can rebuild their own lives and trade will be reconnected.
And Josh,
where is the money they've offered?
Guys,
this is good. This is good, Steve.
We've got 4 minutes and we've got 4 panelists, and I'd like each panelist to take a minute, 60 seconds, to say what the U.S. policy going forward should be. Crisply. We're going to start with Mara.
So my fellow panelists are absolutely right in raising concerns about the impact of sanctions on the civilian population. I think Iraq is a cautionary tale of where sanctions were not sufficient, were really overbroad to a cruel extent that really punished the Iraqi people, which then backfired against the U.S. And really harmed our reputation there, and this has really hindered Iraq's sort of state building ever since. But I think it's premature to sort of write off sanctions as being totally ineffective or incapable of being more narrowly targeted. In the context of Syria, we've spent billions of dollars developing highly precise, sophisticated, smart weapons. There's talk of smart sanctions. I don't think we're as far along in figuring out how to target these very precisely. But I think I think it would be a real mistake, I think, to give up on the idea of sanctions. And what message would that then send to Putin? And in the context of sort of global resurgence of authoritarianism around the world, I really worry about not sort of continuing to make an effort to do sanctions as best we can while minimizing the suffering of the Syrian people.
Super. Thank you, Mara. Bill.
I would say, first of all, that we should maintain the U.S. troops that are in northeastern Syria. I think they've done a vital effort against ISIS. I think that effort is continuing, and they're working successfully with our local partners, the SDF. As Mara described in her remarks, that they're doing very important work also in providing support for the SDF as it maintains these makeshift prisons that are trying to create security for ISIS extremists who are in prison, and also provide some sort of security for the overall al-Hol camp until some sort of solution can be arrived at. I think we need to continue the humanitarian effort, which we're doing with others. I think on the sanctions side, we need to look very carefully. I don't think we will, to be honest. I think that train has left the station, but I think we should look carefully at sanctions, especially the broadest sanctions, and examine the extent to which they are having a humanitarian impact, even if it's the broadest sort of impact on the economy and on rebuilding the economy. I think that is something that should be looked at, but I'm not confident it will. My general sense is I'm a little pessimistic. I think we're looking at an impasse on Syria policy, and I think it's likely to continue.
Thank you. Jim.
Very quickly, I think unless we're going to restart the, if you will, the Kerry-Jeffrey negotiations through the Russians or directly with the Assad regime, which is an interesting prospect, I think we need to get behind the Arabs. That's the only game in town right now. And as I said, all 7 of those things I talked about, and I keep coming back to them, and people never listen to me, but they keep on popping up. Those 7 things have to be fixed. That's what makes Syria today a total shit show. If you don't fix these things, you don't get the Turkish, Israeli, American militaries and all of these paramilitary forces off the battlefield, and you're not going to get hundreds of billions of dollars to flow into that country. It is that simple. You've got to fix those things. And the Arabs are the last people in the world. Come on, we've all seen them and how deep their pockets are for investing in shit shows. They're not going to put money into this thing, not because of the sanctions, but because there are all of these problems. Fix the problems and the country will be able to be fixed. If you don't fix those problems, and that ultimately is Assad and his supporters, this thing is going to stay a frozen conflict, period.
Thanks, Jim. Josh, last word. You've got, well, it's 101. Shoot.
I think the United States policy has been misguided. It started out as regime change, and then we got spooked by the opposition. We didn't do regime change. And now we're trying to do regime change or some kind of regime alteration through these sanctions and this crippling regime that has left, which has left 20 million people in Syria beleaguered and traumatized without the ability to rebuild their lives. And now that a lot of that is due to the bad government but why continue to follow a failed policy? The United States is going to leave Syria sooner or later. It's not going to continue for 50 years in Syria. And the United States needs to make preparations for that. And the Kurds can work with the government in Damascus. They've worked with the government in Damascus in the past. It's a minoritarian regime. It needs the Kurds in order to rule the northeast of Syria. And only by repairing those relationships is Syria going to get back on its feet and rebuild. And that's what the Arab governments, I think, have all unanimously come to a decision on in this effort to renormalize. And they're trying to turn a new page. You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. And I don't think we should be at loggerheads and fighting the Arab world over how sanctions. I think we should begin to look at sanctions and begin to lift sanctions. They've all begun to ask, this is a modest beginning, the normalization, but the sanctions are the real problem. And if the Arabs are saying sanctions are a real problem, we're going to get into deep difficulty with our allies in the Middle East if we continue this sanctions regime.
Thanks very much, Josh. And thanks to all the panelists. This was a stimulating, very rich discussion. Glad we had it. We didn't solve anything, but we certainly unpacked the issues. So thanks again, and hope to see you all again.